So I just wanted to take the time out and briefly talk to you about the E-2 visa. What qualifies you to apply for an E-2 visa? Is an E-2 visa for everybody? And what are the benefits, pros and cons of applying for one? So what is an E-2 visa? An E-2 visa is basically an investment visa. It requires someone to have made some sort of an investment in a U.S. entity. This can be you, the applicant, who has decided to either purchase shares into an existing, already up and running company, or he has decided to start a new venture, a startup in the U.S. Or it could be somebody who's coming to work for a company that's already owned by an E-2 visa holder and is coming here as an employee. So there are several ways, as you can see, to be eligible and to get an E-2 visa. Is everybody eligible for an E-2 visa? Unfortunately not. An E-2 visa is a treaty-specific visa, which means it is only for those nationals from countries that have an E-2 treaty with the United States. Which are these countries? Some common countries that I can think of: European countries such as United Kingdom, Germany, Italy, Asian countries such as Japan, Thailand, South Korea, oceanic countries like Australia, New Zealand, countries from South America, Argentina, Paraguay. So as you can see, there are basically countries in almost every continent where you must have a treaty with the United States that allows the nationals to then apply for an E-2 visa. What are these bilateral agreements? Sometimes countries enter into bilateral agreements with one another that promote economic growth, that promote employment opportunities, that the nationals of those countries that give each other the opportunity to then go and then explore investment opportunities. So that's basically E-2 visa in a nutshell. What are some of the general eligibility requirements for an E-2 visa? As we briefly discussed in the beginning of the video, is that one must have some sort of an investment in a U.S. entity. It's in the name of the visa. It's an investment visa. Some of the other requirements are, what if there is an investment? You have to show the source of your investments. The consulate or USCIS wants to make sure that the money that's being invested has not come from any illicit or illegal activities. So you must be able to show the complete source of your funds. It requires you to actually make an investment. That means it requires you to actually spend the money. It requires you to have the ability to come and direct and develop the company if you're applying as an E-2 treaty investor. It requires you to show that you have the ability to direct and develop. There are several ways to do it. The first and most common way is if you own at least 50% of a U.S. entity, you're able to show the ability to direct and develop due to your ownership of the company. If you're coming here in an executive managerial position, your duties can show that you have the ability to direct and develop. So these are just some of the requirements, basic eligibility requirements of an E-2 visa. Another basic requirement of the E-2 visa is that the U.S. entity must be owned at least 50% by the nationals of the treaty country, which means if the treaty country's nationals of Canada must own at least 50% of the U.S. entity. In cases where the U.S. entity is owned by another company in the treaty country, then they look at the ownership of the owning company and see if that is owned at least 50% by the nationals of the treaty country. In short, the E-2 visa is just a great way for somebody to safeguard the investment that they have made in the U.S. entity to then come and lead and direct the U.S. entity and show how and to safeguard their investment. Is every country eligible for an E-2 visa? No. As we mentioned, the country must have a treaty with the United States. Unfortunately, there are some countries out there that do not have such a treaty. The most common ones, India and China. If you are a national of India and China or any other country that does not have a treaty with the U.S., unfortunately, this is not something that is an option for you. But don't lose hope. There are some other ways that you could qualify. For example, dual nationality. If you are a dual national of two countries, one of which that does not have a treaty with the United States, but another country that does, for example, dual nationals of Iran and Canada. As a Canadian citizen, you could be eligible to apply for an E-2 visa. There are also ways where you can make an investment in a country and get citizenship that would then qualify you to apply for an E-2 visa. The most common example is investment in countries like Grenada, where you can make a certain monetary investment, get citizenship, spend a certain amount of time as a resident of Grenada, and then be eligible to apply for an E-2 visa as a Grenadian national. What are some of the benefits of getting an E-2 visa? First and foremost, as an E-2 visa holder, you can bring in your spouse and children under the age of 21 to the United States with you. Also, your spouses can get work permit just by being a spouse of an E-2 visa holder. This work permit is unlimited. It basically allows them to work for anyone or even themselves once they come to the United States. Also, another thing I want to mention is that due to certain changes in rules a couple of years ago, spouses of E-2 visa holders no longer have to file a separate work permit once they're in the U.S. to get work authorization. They are authorized to work pursuant to their status as a spouse of an E-2 visa holder. I want to end by saying that the E-2 visa is just a fantastic way for someone who's looking for an entrepreneurial opportunity in the United States. It requires you to make a substantial investment in the US, which means you have to show that you spent enough money to get the business either up and running or to the point where the business is almost up and running. All the business really needs is for you to come here and start running it. It has potential benefits for your family members, your spouse, your children. It requires active involvement from you. So if you're thinking of investing in like a passive business, somewhere where you just invest in real estate and expect it to grow, that unfortunately is not very E-2 friendly. This has to be a business which is just active, which requires an active involvement from you, in which it has to show that you're actively looking to direct and develop and grow the business. So if this is something that you are thinking of, the E-2 visa is just a really good option for you.